The morning after Pearl Harbor, frost lay heavy on the wheat fields of Kansas. The Carter farm sat on the edge of the Smoky Hill River, 20 miles from the nearest town, a handful of barns and wind-beaten fences surrounded by open prairie. The world beyond the horizon was at war, but to 17-year-old William Carter, the morning still smelled of hay and cold earth. He woke before dawn, as he always did, to milk the cows and check the traps he'd set the night before for foxes. The radio in the kitchen, an old Philco with a cracked dial, had been on all night. His mother had sat beside it, staring at nothing, as a calm voice from Washington spoke words that changed everything. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The Carters were not a family of speeches. His father, a wiry man with hands like leather, had fought in France in 1918 but rarely spoke of it. That morning, he only said, "You'll have to go." "We all do." William nodded. He was quiet even then, slow-spoken, steady, the sort of boy who looked twice before speaking once. His world had been cows, fences, the rhythm of planting and harvest. But the news on the radio had lit something inside him that no farm work could quiet. He had grown up with a rifle in his hands. At 12, he'd been shooting rabbits with his father's .22, and by 16 he could drop a coyote at 200 yards. In a place where the land stretched forever, accuracy wasn't a skill, it was survival. Ammunition cost money, and no one wasted a bullet. His father used to say, "If you can't do it with one shot, you shouldn't pull the trigger." That sentence would follow him into war like a shadow. In March 1942, he boarded a train in Topeka, wearing a borrowed suit and carrying a paper bag with a sandwich and a Bible. The ticket said San Diego. The Marine Corps was looking for riflemen, and he had heard they were the best in the world. He didn't tell anyone that the real reason he chose the Marines was the rifle range. He wanted to learn how to shoot better than anyone alive. Boot camp at San Diego was a world away from Kansas. The heat, the sand, the roar of drill instructors, everything about it was designed to strip a boy down and rebuild him into something else. Carter spoke little, listened much, and did exactly as he was told. He didn't complain. He didn't boast. On the rifle range at Camp Matthews, when most recruits struggled to hit black at 500 yards, Carter's tight groups began turning heads. The instructors watched him adjust his sights, steady his breathing, squeeze instead of jerk. One gunnery sergeant, an old-timer named Frank Delgado, leaned over his shoulder and muttered, "You ever done this before, Kansas?" Carter answered without looking up. "Only on varmints, sir." Delgado chuckled. "Well, you're a natural-born varmint killer, then." By the end of qualification, Carter had shot an unprecedented 241 out of 250. Expert rifleman, the highest mark. Delgado took him aside afterward. "You keep your head, boy, and you'll go places. The Corps has use for steady hands." 2 months later, he shipped out with the 1st Marine Division to a place most Americans couldn't find on a map, Guadalcanal. The name meant nothing when he first heard it. It would soon mean everything. The trip across the Pacific took 3 weeks. The sea was endless, and the boredom unbearable. Men played cards, smoked, talked about home. Carter spent his time cleaning his rifle, an M1903 Springfield, the same model Marines had carried since World War I. He treated it like a living thing, checking the bolt face for wear, oiling the barrel, memorizing the feel of every part. It calmed him. By the time they sighted land, he could field strip it blindfolded. Guadalcanal smelled of rot and rain. The jungle swallowed sound, and the heat pressed like a hand on the back of the neck. The Marines landed in August 1942, unopposed at first, and spent the first days digging foxholes and hauling crates of ammunition off the beach. Carter was assigned to Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, a rifle platoon of 40 men who had no idea what was waiting for them inland. At night, the jungle came alive. Crickets, frogs, and unseen things cried out in the dark. The Japanese struck first on the third night, probing the perimeter near the airstrip that the Marines had nicknamed Henderson Field. Carter fired his first shot in anger that night, a single round at a flicker of movement among the trees. The return fire came instantly, bursts of automatic weapons, tracer rounds streaking red across the darkness. When dawn came, the ground was littered with bodies in khaki and olive. It was the first time he saw what a bullet really did to a man. He did not feel triumph, only a strange, heavy calm. The weeks blurred into rain and fear. The Japanese attacked again and again, screaming through the jungle at night. The Marines learned to fight by instinct, to shoot not at shapes but at sounds, flashes, movement. Carter's patience and sharp eye made him different. While others fired bursts, he fired once, twice, and hit. Delgado noticed. One afternoon after a firefight near the Tenora River, the gunnery sergeant walked over and said, "You're wasted in a line platoon, Kansas. I'm sending your name up for Scout Sniper School." Carter didn't answer. He just nodded. The sniper section trained in a coconut grove on the edge of the airstrip. There were no manuals, no formal curriculum. The instructors were men who had survived long enough to learn by doing. They taught camouflage using mud and palm fronds, stalking techniques borrowed from hunters, and range estimation by eye. Carter absorbed it all. He learned to crawl for hours through mud without snapping a twig, to steady his breath until the rifle felt like an extension of his heartbeat. The weapon he carried was different now, a modified M1903A1 Springfield with an 8x inertial scope, accurate to 800 yards. Heavy, delicate, unforgiving. It suited him perfectly. His first assignment came soon after. Japanese snipers had pinned down a Marine patrol near the Matanacor River. Carter and his spotter, a wiry corporal named Evans, were ordered to eliminate the threat. They crawled through grass slick with rain, inch by inch, until they could see the dark glint of an enemy scope in a banyan tree. Carter exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like a whip. The Japanese sniper tumbled from the tree, lifeless. Evans whispered, "First one." Carter said nothing. After that, the platoon began calling him the farmhand. The name stuck. It carried a kind of reverence. By the end of the campaign, he had 17 confirmed kills, each one recorded in the company log, though he never mentioned them himself. What he did talk about, when he talked at all, was the land, the way the jungle smelled after rain, how it reminded him of home, how it never truly slept. War had not made him loud. It had made him quieter. When Guadalcanal was finally secured in early 1943, the Marines were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and malaria-ridden. Carter weighed 132 pounds, down 20 from when he'd landed. He had learned what fear tasted like and how to live alongside it. His rifle was scarred, the bluing worn off the barrel from constant handling. He carried it like a relic. The Corps sent him next to Bougainville. The fight there was different, steeper terrain, thicker jungle, more snipers. He found himself stalking men who were as skilled as he was. It became a duel of nerves and patience, days spent motionless, waiting for a single moment. The Japanese snipers were masters of concealment, but Carter's farmer's eye for detail gave him an edge. He noticed the unnatural straightness of a branch, the flicker of sunlight on metal. Once, after 3 days of watching a single tree line, he fired one shot and ended a sniper who had killed 5 Marines. When his spotter congratulated him, he only said, "He was good." His legend grew quietly, spread by others. Officers began requesting him by name for reconnaissance and overwatch. He did not seek it. It simply happened. By 1944, his record stood at 42 confirmed kills, more than any other Marine in his regiment. The numbers meant nothing to him, but they meant everything to those who survived because of his aim. In March of that year, he was promoted to sergeant and given a small team of snipers to train. He taught them what he knew: patience, discipline, the art of seeing before acting. "You don't hate who you shoot," he told them. "You just do your job cleaner than he does." It was the kind of sentence that could only come from someone who had seen too much and still believed in precision. When the 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu in September 1944, Carter was among them. The island was a furnace, white coral, no shade, temperatures soaring above 110 degrees. The Japanese defenders were dug deep into caves and ridges. The battle would last longer and cost more than anyone expected. It was there, among the ridges of Umurbrugal, that Carter's skills reached their peak, and where the legend of the farm boy sniper truly began. The heat on Peleliu was inhuman. Even before the first shot was fired, men were collapsing from exhaustion, their canteens empty, their skin blistered by the white coral that reflected sunlight like a mirror. The battle began on September 15, 1944, when the first wave of the 1st Marine Division hit the beaches under a hail of machine gun fire. The Japanese had learned from earlier defeats. Instead of meeting the Marines on the shore, they had turned the island into a labyrinth of hidden bunkers and caves, perfectly camouflaged and dug into the ridges. It would take weeks of brutal, inch-by-inch fighting to clear them. Sergeant William Carter came ashore with Fox Company, his rifle wrapped in oilcloth, the long unearthly scope glinting faintly under the tropical sun. He had been told this would be a short operation, 3, maybe 4 days. It would take more than 2 months. The first days were chaos. Marines clawed forward over coral ridges so sharp they sliced through boots, fighting an invisible enemy firing from holes that seemed to appear and vanish at will. The air reeked of cordite, sweat, and rotting palm trees. The heat cooked corpses in hours. Men went mad from thirst. But through it all, Carter's calm never wavered. He moved deliberately, always looking, always thinking. Where others fired blindly, he studied the terrain, searching for the tiny details that betrayed a human presence, a shadow that didn't move with the sun, a patch of coral darker than the rest. His first major action came on the 3rd day, near the Umurbrugal Pocket, a jagged maze of ridges the Marines nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge. A platoon advancing along the slope had been pinned down by a Japanese machine gun nest hidden in the rocks. Every attempt to flank it ended with men cut to pieces before they could reach cover. Carter crawled up the ridge alone, belly to the ground, his spotter Evans following a few yards behind. The coral shredded their uniforms and tore at their knees, but they moved silently, inch by inch. Carter stopped near a cluster of boulders overlooking the ravine where the machine gun chattered. Through the scope, he saw the faint shimmer of heat rising from the weapon's barrel. 2 Japanese soldiers crouched beside it, feeding the belt. He steadied his breathing, felt the stock settle against his shoulder, and fired. The first man dropped instantly. The second ducked, frantic, and Carter shot again. Silence followed, eerie and absolute. The Marines below cheered and surged forward. The ridge was theirs. That single action earned Carter a Bronze Star recommendation, though he never mentioned it afterward. To him, it was simply another day's work. But among the men, the stories spread. They said the farmhand could see through rock, that he never missed. Within a week, officers were calling on him for precision tasks, taking out snipers who had halted entire companies, clearing ridges before assaults. He became the quiet constant of the battlefield, the unseen force that tipped the balance when everything else failed. One morning near the end of September, Carter's team was tasked with locating a Japanese sniper who had killed 4 Marines in a single day near the base of the ridge. The enemy shooter was clever. He changed positions constantly, never fired more than twice from the same hole, and vanished before counterfire could find him. Carter studied the terrain through his scope for nearly an hour before noticing something, a cluster of ferns that swayed slightly against the wind's direction. He waited. Then, for a fraction of a second, he saw a reflection, a scope catching the sun. He fired once. The reflection vanished. When the Marines searched later, they found a dead sniper with a hole clean through his temple. Carter had hit him at 710 yards, through heat, shimmer, and glare. "Luck," he said when Evans congratulated him. "No," Evans replied, shaking his head. "Skill." By the time Peleliu was declared secure in November, Carter had 82 confirmed kills, a number that placed him among the deadliest marksmen in the Pacific. The Corps didn't advertise such statistics. Snipers were tools, not heroes, but among the men who fought beside him, his reputation bordered on myth. He was the man who could end an ambush with a single shot, the quiet figure who stayed behind when everyone else retreated, the steady hand that never shook. After Peleliu, Carter's battalion was sent to Pavuvu for rest and refit, though rest was a relative term. The small island was a muddy, insect-infested staging area where Marines rebuilt their strength before the next battle. Carter spent most of his time on the range, training replacements. He taught them everything he'd learned, the patience to wait hours for a single opportunity, the discipline to breathe through fear, the humility to know that one mistake erased 100 successes. "Your rifle's your handshake," he told them. "How you use it says who you are." He never boasted about his kills. When younger Marines asked how many, he'd reply, "Enough to wish it was fewer." Yet he believed deeply in his duty. The sniper's paradox, detached precision in the midst of chaos, had become his way of surviving the madness of war. He did not fight out of hate, but out of obligation, to his comrades, to the mission, to the simple truth that if he didn't pull the trigger, someone else might die. In early 1945, the 1st Marine Division received orders for what would become their final and most brutal campaign, Okinawa. It would be the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War, nearly 500,000 troops on both sides, with the outcome deciding the course of the conflict. Carter, now 21 and already a legend among his peers, would enter it as the Corps' most experienced sniper. When his transport ship approached the island that April, the sea was grey with rain, the air thick with the smell of oil and anticipation. The men crowded the railings, staring at the distant line of beach. Carter stood apart, his rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes fixed on the horizon. Evans nudged him. "Think this'll be the last one?" Carter thought for a moment, then said quietly, "One way or another." The landing at Okinawa was almost peaceful at first. The beaches were deserted, the resistance light. But as the Marines pushed inland, the trap closed. The Japanese had withdrawn to the hills, building a fortress of tunnels, caves, and concealed gun positions that turned every ridge into a fortress. The fighting became a grinding war of attrition, measured not in miles but in yards. For a sniper, it was both nightmare and opportunity. The terrain offered endless vantage points but no safety. Enemy marksmen haunted every ridge, and artillery turned the hillsides into rainstorms of shrapnel. Carter adapted quickly. He and Evans operated alone for days at a time, crawling through rice paddies, hiding in shell craters, marking targets for advancing Marines. He shot machine gunners, observers, officers, anyone whose removal made a difference. Each kill was a calculation, never an impulse. On May 5th, during the battle for Shuri Ridge, Carter achieved what his commanding officer later called the single most consequential shot of the campaign. A Japanese forward observer had climbed a radio mast overlooking the valley, directing artillery fire that pinned down an entire battalion. No one could reach him. The distance was estimated at nearly 900 yards, beyond reliable range even for the best rifles. Carter studied the wind, adjusted his scope, and waited until the man leaned out to speak into his radio. Then he fired. The figure slumped forward, and within minutes, the enemy's shelling ceased. The Marines advanced. After the battle, Delgado, now a captain, found him cleaning his rifle beside a crater. "You know you just saved 200 men, right?" he said. Carter shrugged. "Didn't think about it." Delgado smiled. "That's what makes you dangerous, Kansas." As Okinawa dragged on, Carter's precision became both his gift and his burden. He rarely missed, but each shot carried weight. The war had changed him. The quiet boy from Kansas was still there, somewhere behind the eyes, but his innocence had been replaced by something colder, steadier. He no longer flinched at the sight of death, but neither did he celebrate survival. He simply endured. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, Carter was aboard a hospital ship bound for Guam, recovering from malaria and exhaustion. He weighed 125 pounds and carried in his logbook 131 confirmed kills, the highest of any Marine sniper in the Pacific. There were others who had shot more in Europe, perhaps, but none who had done it in such conditions, against such odds. To the men who knew him, he was a legend not because of numbers, but because he had stayed alive through 3 years of hell and never lost his calm. He was discharged in December 1945 and returned to Kansas. The farm was smaller now, his parents older, the land unchanged. The horizon was still wide, the air still clean, but he was not the same boy who had left. He worked the fields quietly, his rifle locked away in the barn, and spoke little about the war. When neighbors asked if he'd seen much fighting, he would nod once and say, "Enough." Years later, when journalists wrote about Marine snipers in the Pacific, his name surfaced briefly in declassified records. Sergeant William Carter, Fox Company, 1st Marines, 131 confirmed. There were no interviews, no memoirs. He had gone back to the only place that ever made sense to him, the open land, the wind, the silence. And in that silence, somewhere between the rows of wheat and the endless sky, the most lethal shot of the Pacific disappeared back into the country that had made him. The war ended, but for men like William Carter, peace did not arrive on the same train that brought them home. In early 1946, the troop cars clattered across the Kansas plains, their windows fogged by the breath of soldiers who stared out at the same fields they had left behind years earlier. When the train stopped at Topeka, Carter stepped off in a wrinkled uniform, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and the Bible his mother had packed for him in 1942. He looked thinner, harder, older than his 22 years. The depot smelled of coal smoke and spring rain. The war was over, but its weight still clung to him like dust. His parents met him with tears and silence. His father's handshake was brief, his mother's hug long. They could see it in his eyes, the distance, the way he measured every sound before turning his head. For the first few weeks, he hardly spoke at all. He rose early, fed the livestock, mended fences, and worked until dark. The rhythm of the farm was the only thing that made sense. The rifle he had brought back, his Springfield, the same one he'd carried through Peleliu and Okinawa, stayed locked in an old chest in the barn. He told his father, "I've had my fill of shooting, but the land had a way of healing men like him." The days passed quietly, each one a little less heavy than the last. When neighbors asked about the war, he would smile faintly and say, "Just a lot of hot days." Sometimes, at sunset, he would walk to the edge of the wheat field and watch the wind ripple across it like waves. The sound reminded him of the ocean he'd crossed twice, of the endless gray horizons of the Pacific. He thought often of the men who hadn't come back, Evans, who had been killed on Okinawa by a mortar shell just days before the surrender. Delgado, who stayed in the Corps and wrote once a year until the letters stopped coming. Their faces returned to him in dreams, half-lit and smiling, as though waiting for him to take the next shot. He tried to live a normal life. He married a local girl, Mary Henderson, in 1948, a quiet ceremony at the small church near Salina. She was gentle and patient, with a way of talking that filled the silences he couldn't. They had 2 children, both boys. Carter never spoke of his war, but the habits lingered. He slept lightly, waking at every creak of the house. He kept the barn door locked, and when thunderstorms rolled across the plains, he would stand by the window, watching the lightning flicker like artillery flashes on the horizon. He rarely mentioned his service, yet his marksmanship remained legendary in the county. At the annual fair, he would win the turkey shoot without effort, though he refused the prizes. "Just practice," he'd say, handing the turkey to whoever came second. Once, a local newspaper reporter who'd heard rumors of a Marine sniper from the islands came to interview him. Carter declined politely. "The only thing worth writing about is the men who didn't make it back," he said, then turned and went back to work on the tractor. Time moved on. The country forgot its war heroes as new wars came: Korea, Vietnam. Carter aged quietly, his hair turning gray, his hands still steady. The rifle remained in its chest, wrapped in oilcloth. His sons grew up never seeing it fired. To them, their father was just a man who worked hard and spoke little, who could fix anything and never missed when he threw a stone at a fence post. It wasn't until years later, long after his death, that they discovered what he had really been. In the late 1980s, the Marine Corps began digitizing its wartime archives. Old records from the Pacific campaigns were declassified and scanned, after-action reports, sniper logs, commendations, and personal notes. Among them was a faded folder marked Scout Sniper Section, Fox Company, 2/1 Marines, 1942–45. Inside were entries in careful handwriting: dates, locations, confirmed kills, remarks. One page bore the name Carter W.J., and the tally 131 confirmed, 17 probable. In the margin, a note from Captain Delgado read, "Reliable, never misses, never boasts, keeps the men steady." A young historian named Daniel Klein, researching Marine marksmanship for a book on the Pacific War, came across the file and was struck by the name. There were detailed maps, sketches, even a photograph: a young man in a faded helmet, squinting through a scope under a palm tree. His face was calm, unsmiling. Klein traced the service number and discovered that Sergeant William James Carter had been discharged in December 1945 and returned to Kansas. He decided to find him. But Carter was gone. He had died in 1979 of a heart attack while fixing a fence, buried in a small country cemetery beneath a simple headstone that read only, "William J. Carter, USMC, 1923–1979. There were no decorations carved into the stone, no mention of battles or heroics. It was as modest as the man himself. Klein tracked down Carter's widow, Mary, still living on the farm. She invited him in for coffee and listened quietly as he explained who he was. When he told her husband's wartime record, she smiled softly. "He never said much about it," she admitted. "I always knew there was more, but he didn't like talking about killing. He said he was just good at keeping other boys alive." From the attic, she brought down a small wooden box. Inside was the Springfield rifle, the unertl scope still attached, and a stack of letters tied with a frayed cord. The letters were from Evans, Delgado, and others. Short, simple notes written between campaigns. One read, "To Kansas, if you ever make it home, buy a farm and grow something good. You've earned it." Klein asked if he could include Carter's story in his book. Mary agreed on one condition, that it not be written as legend but as truth. He was proud of his work, she said, but he carried the weight of every man he killed. Don't make him larger than life. He was just human. When the book, Marksman of the Pacific, was published in 1992, a whole chapter was dedicated to the farmhand. It told the story of a Kansas boy who went to war, became one of the most lethal shots in the Pacific, and returned home to live quietly among his fields. Readers were struck by the humility of it, the ordinariness that hid something extraordinary. Veterans who read it wrote letters to the publisher, saying they remembered a quiet Marine who could hit anything he aimed at and never missed a day's watch. For a moment, the name William Carter flickered back into the light. The Marine Corps later included his record in their official marksmanship archives, alongside the better-known snipers of later wars. A citation followed, awarded posthumously, for exceptional skill and composure in combat operations across the Pacific Theater, 1942–45. It was delivered to his family by mail, folded in a plain envelope. His sons framed it and hung it beside a faded photograph of their father in uniform, smiling faintly at the camera. Today, his rifle rests in the Kansas Museum of History, displayed behind glass with a simple placard. Sergeant William J. Carter, USMC. 1st Marine Division, Scout Sniper, 1942–45. 131 confirmed kills across Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Peleliu, and Okinawa. Known to his comrades as the farmhand. Visitors rarely stop long at the case. It sits quietly between exhibits of larger battles and famous generals. But those who do linger notice something hauntingly ordinary about the weapon: its worn stock, its plain metal, the absence of ornament. It looks like any rifle a farmer might carry across a field at dawn. And that, perhaps, is fitting, because William Carter never saw himself as a hero. He was a farm boy who answered his country's call, who turned the patience of the fields into the precision of war, and who returned to the soil that had made him. His story is not one of glory, but of endurance, of a man who learned to hold his breath, take the shot, and then live with the silence that followed. By the turn of the new century, the wars of the Pacific had faded into black-and-white photographs and aging documentaries, but among military historians and the tight fraternity of Marine snipers, the name William Carter began to surface again. It happened quietly, almost accidentally, through the kind of meticulous research that comes from curiosity more than glory. Young instructors at Quantico Scout Sniper School were combing through the archives looking for early doctrine, anything that might shed light on how their predecessors had developed fieldcraft under the impossible conditions of the Pacific jungles. In one declassified memorandum from 1944, they found a training note signed only Sergeant W. J. Carter, Fox Company. The note read, "A sniper's greatest weapon is not his rifle. It is patience. The wind, the insects, the heat, these are enemies too. Learn them. If you rush the shot, you lose the war in miniature." It was the sort of sentence instructors dream of quoting. Simple, profound, true. Within months, it was printed on the classroom wall at Quantico, beneath the heading Principles of Observation and Fire, Pacific Campaign Notes, 1944. Cadets began asking who Carter was. Few knew, but the name carried weight, the kind that invites reverence through mystery. As the Marine Corps evolved into the era of precision warfare, the lineage of its sniper program became a point of pride. Modern rifles bore little resemblance to the old Springfield M1903A1 that Carter had used, but the essence remained the same: discipline, patience, exactness. Instructors traced their ethos back to those first jungle marksmen who had learned the art the hard way, through trial and blood. Among them, Carter was now recognized as one of the quiet founders of their craft. In 2004, during a centennial symposium on marine marksmanship, a retired colonel named Peter Delgado, the son of Carter's old commanding officer, delivered a speech titled "The Philosophy of a Shot." He spoke not about ballistics or optics, but about temperament. "Carter," he said, "taught us that precision is a moral act. To hit exactly what you aim at, and nothing else, that's not just skill. That's restraint." The audience, a mix of veterans and young Marines, rose in applause. For a brief moment, the farm boy from Kansas was remembered as more than a number on a file card. Meanwhile, back in Kansas, the Carter farm still stood. Mary had passed away years earlier, and their sons had taken over the land. One of them, John Carter, had spent years collecting his father's letters, photographs, and service records. In 2010, he donated the entire collection to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The archivists were astonished. Inside one envelope was an original field notebook filled with range sketches, humidity calculations, and handwritten notes on wind drift. At the top of one page, in faint pencil, were the words, "Every bullet has its purpose. Don't waste them." The handwriting was small and neat, almost scholarly. For historians, it was a treasure, a direct insight into the mind of a man who had made an art out of stillness. That same year, a documentary team working on a film titled "Snipers of the Pacific" visited Kansas to film interviews. They stood among the wheat fields where Carter had once worked as a boy, the wind bending the stalks in long, golden waves. The narrator spoke softly as the camera panned across the horizon. It was here, on the plains, that William Carter learned the patience that would one day make him lethal. He never sought fame, only accuracy. His story reminds us that war's greatest heroes are often the ones who come home and never speak of it. The documentary aired on PBS in 2012 and drew quiet but widespread praise for its humility. Veterans from across the country wrote letters to the producers, many saying they had known men like Carter, quiet farmers, mechanics, teachers, who had gone to war, done extraordinary things, and then returned to anonymity. One letter from a retired Marine sniper in Afghanistan read, "We still live by his words. Every bullet has its purpose." By then, Carter's name had become a symbol in the sniper community, a shorthand for quiet mastery. At Quantico, new graduates received a small booklet of quotations and lessons drawn from a century of Marine Corps history. One page bore his photograph and a short inscription. Sergeant William J. Carter, 1st Marine Division, Pacific Theater. Scout Sniper. 131 confirmed kills. The measure of a Marine is not how many he kills, but how many he saves. No one knows who added that last line, but it has remained there ever since. The rifle he carried through 4 campaigns was eventually moved from the Kansas Museum of History to the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, restored and displayed under low, reverent light. The exhibit plaque reads, M1903A1 Springfield Sniper Rifle, used by Sergeant William J. Carter, USMC. Pacific Theater, 1942–45. On loan from the Carter family collection. Visitors stand before it, tracing the worn grooves of the stock through the glass, the faint dent where his hand had rested during thousands of hours of waiting. The metal glints softly beneath the museum lights, and for a moment it's easy to imagine him there again, calm, watchful, unshakable. Each year on the Marine Corps birthday, instructors at Quantico take their students outside before dawn for a silent reflection exercise known as the Still Hour. They sit among the pines with rifles across their knees, watching the horizon until the first light touches the treetops. When the sun rises, an instructor reads aloud from the Corps' Book of Remembrance. The names include legends, Carlos Hathcock, Chuck Mawaney, and now William Carter. The last words of the reading are always the same. To those who learned patience, so that others might live. It is the only tribute Carter would have accepted. Even beyond the military, his story has found its way into civilian life, used in leadership courses, ethics seminars, even rural schools that teach about local heroes. Teachers speak of him not as a killer, but as a man who carried his skill with humility, who understood that precision without conscience is just noise. His story resonates because it feels both distant and familiar. The boy from nowhere who did something impossible, then came home and asked for nothing in return. The farm still belongs to the Carter family. On summer evenings, when the air smells of dust and growing wheat, his grandchildren walk the fields he once knew. The house is quiet. The same windmill still creaks in the yard. Sometimes, when the sky turns red at dusk, John Carter's son, also named William, will look toward the horizon and think of the photograph in the museum, the young man with the rifle and the steady eyes. He was just doing his job, his father says, and the boy nods, understanding something about responsibility, though not yet about war. In the end, the measure of William Carter's legacy is not in his confirmed kills or his medals, but in what he left behind, a philosophy of steadiness, of precision without pride. His story reminds the world that the most dangerous men are often the calmest, and that true mastery, whether in war or peace, lies in knowing exactly when not to pull the trigger. And so the farm boy who became the most lethal shot of the Pacific lives on, not through myth, but through quiet respect. His name is spoken at dawn on marine ranges, whispered in training halls, etched in bronze beneath glass. He is not remembered for the lives he took, but for the lives his precision preserved. The man who learned to wait, to breathe, to see, left behind a lesson that outlasts any war. Accuracy is not just aim, it is awareness. Patience is its truest form of courage.